Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Brightworks. Today we are taking a overarching, complementary, completely over-the-top view of every single tech path that you can have access to in Beyond All Reason. This gets very confusing very quickly, but it doesn't have to be. And once you get some experience with it, it definitely becomes a much easier subject to approach. And so today, hopefully, I'm going to outline all of the different paths available to you, why they make sense, and what you most often are going to go for. So getting right into it, this is the chart, right? This, if you're looking for the chart of the tech path, here it is. You can pause the video, you can look at this, and you can study it, and this will give you everything you need to know. If that's all you needed, then I hope you'd like and subscribe and stay tuned for more content. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. But for everyone else after that crowd has left, we're going to be going into each and every one of these and discussing sort of the path that you might take to go there and the decisions that you might make moving away from there. So we're going to start on the right hand side because it's arguably the simplest, and that is the bot lab. This is probably the most common that you're going to see. The bot start is very, very powerful. It's very, very I guess you would say it can adapt to very wide a range of situations, and there's basically a bot for every engagement, every combat. There's a bot that's the right choice for taking that engagement. So the T1 bot lab is where you'll start. This is your, maybe I should have wrote up here commander or whatever, but you'll start with the T1 bot lab. And then once you get enough metal up and running, either if you're teching, you'll have sacrificed your commander, or if you're pushing the front line, you're reclaiming, you're resurrecting, you're making sure that you're pulling metal in as fast as you can. And once you're up to, I don't know, let's say a good 35 metal per second or something like that, you're looking pretty solid, and you're going to have enough metal to start teching up to T2. This transition right here is very dependent on how much metal you can pull off of the front lines. But assuming that you're good about it, or at least average about it, this should be maybe around 14 minutes. You're probably looking at stepping up to Tech 2. Now, once you've gotten up to Tech 2, it's pretty simple from there. Really, your only options are to go for a T3 gantry. So you're going to step up to the T3 gantry probably after building quite a bit of T2 economy. I would say at least one advanced fusion reactor is probably good, but some people like to go for two, or maybe an advanced fusion reactor and two regular fusion reactors. Just make sure that you have the 4-to-1 ratio of energy converters to fusion reactors, and you should be all set. Roughly speaking, I like to tech up to T3 gantry around 100 metal per second. And once you get up to that much metal per second, energy kind of becomes irrelevant, because that's all you need to build in order to improve your economy, right? Because you're just building more energy to fund more energy converters, so you should have enough energy regardless of what your economy looks like. So 100 metal per second is kind of what you're aiming for there. And then, yeah, just make sure you have enough advanced fusions to get there. And then once you get the T3 gantry, you win. There you go. That's sort of the end of the game scenario, right? Once you get to T3, you just keep scaling your economy and keep producing T3 units until eventually you win the game. Now, next up, arguably just as simple, but a little bit easier in some respects, a little bit harder in others, is the air start. So very similar to bots, you start with the air lab. Usually you won't see people start with the air lab. You'll see them start with the bot lab and then transition into the air lab. That's usually very, very common. Oh, and by the way, you might notice that I've drawn these lines across here. Any of the T1 labs can transition to another lab connected to them, like adjacent on this chart here. So you start Navy, you can go to vehicle, you can go to hover, you go to air, you go to bot, and similarly for all of the T1 things here. So just in case you were curious about that. But anyway, getting into T1 air, again, if you're playing air, you're probably playing a backline position, so you're probably getting up to T2 air after maybe pumping out a few bombers. If you're Cortex, maybe making some shuriken, maybe a couple fighters to stop any bombers coming your way, all that good stuff, and then you tech up to T2 relatively quickly. I don't have much notes for you if you're playing air and you're playing a frontline position. That's just not going to work out very well. So just do your best in that situation, I suppose. Anyways, once you've gotten to T2 air, you have access to those T2 constructors, and those are very highly coveted. So make sure that you let your team know that you're selling them, or you're giving them away, or whatever's going to happen, because they're so convenient for building those massive economy structures where they don't get tangled up in the mess of all the buildings that they're trying to put up and all that good stuff. So Make sure to offer these to your teammate, the T2 constructors, because those are very valuable. But again, you just scale your economy, keep building it, and eventually you reach T3, keep building your economy, keep scaling up, and then eventually you win the game. Now we're getting into some of the complex stuff. We're going to talk about Hovercraft. Now, Hovercraft are interesting because they do have that rocket Hovercraft, which is a really powerful siege option very, very early on into the game. They get outclassed pretty quickly as soon as T2 of any kind comes out. But very early in the game, those Hovercraft rocket launchers can be very, very potent for that frontline offense. So you might consider going Hovercraft if you're a backline player and you're looking to support the frontline with some interesting tactical options. And so you send them a few Hovercraft each. And they're going to be very grateful. I think it's 3 Hovercraft missiles to break a T1 light laser tower. Just 3 rockets to tear one of those down. So you build 3 of them and you send them to a forward commander. They're going to have a really, really nice day. Now the other options are, of course, the construction options, which is more what we're focusing on here. So let's talk about that. Now the first thing that you can do with a Hovercraft constructor is go for seaplanes. And so we're going to talk about seaplanes when we get to Navy, all the way over here. But for now, just know that you can go for seaplanes in the water. But you can also tech up to a T2 vehicle or a T2 Navy. And as far as I understand it, it is actually the only vehicle in the game, the only construction worker in the game that can actually go for 2 different Tech 2 construction plants, 2 advanced bot labs, or advanced unit labs, maybe we should say. So that is really powerful. It does give you a pretty advanced, or rather a pretty wide berth of different options that you have, right? Whether you need to go for Navy or you need to go for vehicles, you kind of have the best of both worlds there. It doesn't make the prices any cheaper, right? So you still kind of have to choose one or the other because, of course, they're very expensive, especially early on in the game. But you do have that option if you're Hovercraft to tech into Navy if you want to contest sea a little bit harder, or tech into vehicles if you think that would be a bit more advantageous. Now moving along here, we have the Tech 1 vehicles. And the Tech 1 vehicles, again, they can go into seaplanes with their amphibious construction vehicle. Go check out the Seaplanes video if you want to know more about seaplanes specifically. We'll talk about them briefly here, but there's a whole video on that that's going to be coming live. I think it'll be up before this video is out. So anyway, T1 vehicles can go into seaplanes, but of course can also tech into T2 vehicles. Now, this is important because the vehicles don't have any sort of reclaim specific vehicle. There's no resurrection reclaim thing like there is in the bot lab. So you have to send a construction vehicle all the way up to the front lines, which can be very pricey. So it's a lot more important that you keep that construction vehicle alive up there, because replacing it is a lot more expensive than replacing a bot or an air constructor or something like that. So just a note to keep in mind on this transition between Tech 1 vehicles and Tech 2 vehicles. But you should basically be doing the same thing, reclaiming metal off the front lines, making sure that you are providing as much tactical efficiency as you can to get the most out of those units that you have up there, because they're very, very metal dense. You need to make sure that you're reclaiming your units when they fall, and as well as reclaiming any enemy units to make the difference up in the metal that you lose when you reclaim your own units. But eventually you should be able to tech up to this T2 economy. Now from here, it's very much the same as the other T2 sections, where you just keep scaling your economy until around 100 metal per second, maybe more, maybe less, depending on how much metal you can reclaim. And then you go for your T3 gantry. At this point, you're just using T2 to scale your economy, and you produce T3 gantry units until you win. Now, moving back up to the top here, we have the T1 Navy, and the Navy lab is a bit interesting because it can go for any of these other ones, although it's kind of hard to find a spot where the Navy constructor can actually build these labs on land. But of course, it can also go for seaplanes. So we'll talk about seaplanes in their own section here in just a minute, but let's talk about the Navy first. So the Navy can basically, they only stay in the water, right? And so there's a few options for sieging the land. The Epoch or the I believe it's called the Black Hydra for Cortex, the capital ships, the big mamas, if you will. Those are your options for long range siege on the land, but those are very expensive. So you essentially have to go up into a T2 economy before you can even start thinking about those. So for the T1 Navy specifically, you're mostly looking at like tiny fleets, right? You're looking at destroyers and assault frigates and submarines in tight little formations, followed by a resurrection sub to mop up any of the metal that sinks to the ocean floor. the basics for T1 Navy. But much like the vehicles, T1 Navy is very, very metal dense, so you have to make sure that you're reclaiming as much of your enemy's fallen units as well as your own. Like it's basically mandatory that you reclaim your own units, but it's how you tech up to T2 is reclaiming your enemy's units. So be aware of that. That transition it costs a lot of money to maintain your army and tech up to a T2 Navy. The T2 Naval Lab is a bit more expensive than the Bot Lab. I think it's 3,200, whereas the all the other ones, all the land ones, are just 2,900. So it's even more expensive, while the units are still expensive as well. But once you finally get there, you get to the T2 Navy, and then you have the option to build the T2 Naval, the T2 Naval economies, which are pretty interesting. They're less efficient than doing advanced fusion economies, but they are more efficient than doing the regular fusion economies. So you can produce more energy and more metal than regular fusions per metal cost or whatever, but it's not more efficient than a advanced fusion lab or an advanced fusion economy. So kind of interesting there. It might be worth teching into some other routes so that you can get those advanced fusions up and running eventually, but it is better than it is technically a T2 economy, because it is better than those regular fusion reactors and whatever else you can build for power in the ocean, which pretty much just comes down to tidal generators. But anyway, once you get to that T2 Navy, you can there's an underwater gantry that you can go for if you still want to produce T3. And so eventually, once you're up to 100 metal, maybe a bit more because the navies tend to be a bit more expensive, but eventually you can get into the T3 gantry, start scaling your economy up, just continue scaling your economy up rather, and then eventually you produce enough units to win the game. Now let's talk about seaplanes. Seaplanes are interesting because there's no teching out of seaplanes. They can't tech higher than their technology level, and so for that they're kind of like a tech 1.5, and that's why I have them in this weird middle ground between the T2 and T1. They fill a weird role where if you're going hovercraft, vehicles, or navy, you can tech into seaplanes, and it sort of gives you access to a really powerful bomber on both sides, as well as a slightly better gunship, a better scout plane, and just like slightly better units than the T1 aircraft would be. But of course it's a bit more expensive, so it's really weird as far as economy wise to get into this, because you want to essentially be ready to step up to a T2 economy and then a little bit more in order to just normally fund a seaplane plant. So you need a lot of tidal generators, you need a lot of energy converters, and it tends to be really inefficient. So I think one of the things that you can do is step up to T2, get a T2 economy going, and then step back down and into seaplanes. If we follow the chart here, you can see that you can go from Navy, vehicle, or hovercraft to go to a seaplane plant. And then from the seaplane plant, you can go up and into any of the T1 options. So you can't go to any T2, but you can use seaplanes to get into air labs, get into bot labs, get into any of these other labs that you want to have access to. And so for that, they're kind of a interesting option because it does open up a lot of doors for you. It opens up a lot of options for you strategically. But what it also means is that you essentially have to you have to commit to this being the highest tech level that you're going to be at for a while, because the seaplane platform is really expensive. And that's not to say that you couldn't just tech back into Navy, tech back into vehicles, whatever you decide to go for with this weird kind of love triangle here. But just be aware that the seaplanes are a dead end as far as technology level goes. It's a trap that you can get stuck in really quickly because a lot of metal gets wrapped up in those seaplanes. Anyways, I think that's all for now. If you wanted one last look at this overarching chart that I've laid out here, feel free to take a screenshot, make it your wallpaper, study the hell out of it like it's a final exam, and you should be good to go. If there's anything you think I've missed or any notes you'd like to leave for me, feel free to leave those down in the comments. I'm sure other people would like to know them as well. I'm sure that would be very helpful. And I think that'll do it for me. So I hope you folk have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video.